Through this program, I've had a chance to get to know Libby just a little bit. Not as much as if we had been allowed to go to Hawaii for the workshop, but I'm, of course, very grateful for any chance to learn from her, and very excited to welcome her to our forum. So thank you so much for being here, Libby.
Thank you so much for the really generous introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your Thursday afternoon to a little bit about what I say. I'm particularly glad to hear that it sounds like there are quite a few students, and I'm hoping that some of what I have to say will resonate with you. In the conversations that I've had with the students here at ASU, which I think is what I want this work to align with, is they're really interested in jobs and careers work that's actually going to make a difference. They don't want to just sort of do things for the sake of doing things. And what I have to share with you here shows sort of a path through geospatial data on how we can make an impact on our communities. Since I know probably the majority of the audience knows a lot about spatial data, I'm going to start here sort of community resilience piece, just a little bit of background. Plus I think it's really interesting, so I hope you think it's interesting as well. So here's sort of definition. So people understand what resilience is, but when it's a community, it's about the capacity for communities and institutions, as well as the individuals, to respond to shocks and long-term stresses. And they can occur broadly to society, to economic systems, as well as to physical systems. There's no time like the present to sort of give really contemporary examples, and unfortunately I wish I could be there with you, but because of the current moment that we're in, COVID-19 and even subsequent events like Hurricane Laura have a profound effect and are really good examples of the kinds of shocks that are happening to our communities. So I've been thinking about community resilience back since 2016. So if we look back here, you can see my cursor, is that right? Somebody has to know. Yes, okay. Since 2016, yes, okay, good. Since 2016, we have an organization, it's a local charity, the Piper Trust, and they do a lot of philanthropy in the area and invest in ASU in many different ways. And in 2016, they commissioned a report called Community Resilience in Maricopa County. Maricopa County is where the city of Phoenix is located. And you'll hear a little bit more about that report, but it's really the basis to say, where are we with respect to community resilience? We're very fortunate. We don't really get hurricanes. We don't get we do get some fires, but we got a lot of assets, but we also have a lot of challenges, which I'll be talking about later. So after that, this is a photograph of ASU's president, Dr. Michael Crow, who has this long-term relationship with the Piper Trust, and he's the one who basically conceptualized this idea of this partnership. And after that, and he invited me to help advance this effort and put together a plan for how we could work collaboratively with the community to advance community resilience. And I'll emphasize more this idea of collaboration, because it's really about connecting the dots, not just sort of going out and getting data from an organization locally, but actually working with the people there, knowing what the knowledge is. And then the rest of the examples from 2018, 2019 going forward, I'll show you a little bit more in detail here, but that's kind of an example of some of the timelines that we have going on here. So we started the idea of a knowledge exchange. So what is a knowledge exchange? So first of all, one of the generous things that wasn't mentioned is that I've actually been at ASU for 23 years. So I've been here for a very long time. And that means that I've taught a lot of students. And that means also then a lot of my students, my former students, are now working at local agencies here. So they're working for the state government and the county government, and they know a lot of stuff because I was their teacher. No, just kidding. But because they really do know a lot about what's going on here in the community. So the idea, if you think about what a university does, is the university is a creator of new knowledge. But that knowledge needs to be used in some kind of meaningful way. So a lot of the history of it, like if you think about land grant colleges, the history of it is that the university creates the knowledge and bestows it upon the community in which they are to act on that knowledge and that information. Well, what I also found is that working with the community is also about listening to them. What are the problems that they know about? What do they face? So this idea of a knowledge exchange, the city governments, the nonprofit sector, and the private communities provide us with ideas and knowledge, as well as us creating new knowledge that we can then share back with the community. So we created this framework around that sort of knowledge exchange format, which is we aim to share with the community, discover common goals, common problems, and then in the end up creating and testing some kind of solution, some kind of responses to those particular problems that we're doing. So it's kind of a new model. So rather than identifying a problem by strictly going to the literature and saying, okay, what is the problem I need to solve? It's really about reaching out and finding new ways to solve problems. I want to draw a little bit of attention to the word solve here, because what you're going to see later on is we change that word from solve to respond, because sometimes we don't necessarily know that the new interventions we create actually solve the problems or unfortunately create new problems. So we've had a little mindset shift with respect to the word solve. So some of our key activities for our knowledge exchange. How do we exchange knowledge? So we have an event called a hunch lunch. So a hunch lunch brings together people from the community around a particular topic, and we have short little lightning talks. So it's some people are from, some are from maybe some of the nonprofit sector, and we exchange our ideas. We exchange our hunches about what's going on. That's at a very high level. Another program we have is a community fellows program, in which individuals from our community partners, as well as from the university, go and do a deeper dive. They go and spend a year working together on common problems. So rather than just sort of working together at a very high level, they're now working together at a deep level. So those are both signature activities that illustrate our exchange. We also do a fair amount with respect to liberating data from unique sources and connecting the dots and have those connections in the past. And then we also, and that's what the resilience dashboard shows as well. And then we also aim to celebrate resilience through an annual resilience prize. So now you can see the difference. Share, discover, respond instead of share, discover, solve is our new way to build community resilience. And just a little tiny bit of context and background for those of you not familiar with the US Southwest. We're located in Arizona. This is Maricopa County, which primarily, if you see this area, is where the city of Phoenix and the majority of the population lives. And then this is a fairly rural, in some cases, agricultural part of Maricopa County, which doesn't have quite as much population. But the Community Resilience Project, which we call PER, Knowledge Exchange for Resilience, looks at all of Maricopa County. So I want to give two sort of theoretical frameworks around resilience that we are basing a lot of work on, and you'll see a couple of these phrases come up later. So Judith Bowden, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation when a program called the Resilient Cities was formed, through experience, she found that there are 5 characteristics of resilience that needed to be cared for in terms of paying attention to whether or not you are resilient. And these are regulation. To explain this a little bit more. Is something fail-safe, or is it actually safe to fail? So when you look at things like shocks and long-term stresses, we know that they're going to happen again. There will be more tornadoes in the US. So we need to create mechanisms that are safe to have these shocks and stresses happen, as opposed to fail-safe. Yes, of course, that builds on this data exchange and knowledge exchange. Diversity, which relates to collaboration, we're building, integrating, finding multiple solutions, as well as adaptability, which is ability to change. Is of course exactly what we're doing right now instead of me being with you in person. So of course, Arizona is in the, isn't this a great picture? I can't see you nod, but I hope you're nodding. This is just an awesome photo of the Phoenix metropolitan area and what's microburst. Many people think of the US Southwest as being a place for these kinds of storms, but we do get pretty significant storms, particularly during our summer monsoon. And because of this, we end up with pretty severe flash flood situations, which we have to have a system to manage those floods. So one of our shocks to our system can be one of these kinds of microbursts. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by some of the characteristics of resilience through this example. So if you look here at this particular map, you can see this sort of green line that goes up here. I think I drew a box around it. This is called the Indian Bend Wash Greenbelt, and you can see sort of the blue spaces. And what this is this is a resilient infrastructure to mitigate flooding. So I would ask if there's a show of hands. I don't know if you can, if you've been to Los Angeles. Los Angeles also has this flash flood problem, but they, but what they've done to help mitigate this is create an attempt to be fail-safe. They know that this is Los Angeles, they know that there's going to be flooding, and so they have taken the LA River and created this sort of concrete space so that when there is the flooding, then the surrounding metropolitan area is protected from these floodwaters. And what you can tell is that if the floodwaters exceeded these banks, then you're going to be in trouble with respect to some of the infrastructure. So that Indian Bend Wash Greenbelt that I showed you instead is a safe to fail system. In other words, we know that it is going to have these microbursts, and we know that there's going to be flooding in this area. So instead of creating a fail-safe system, it's instead actually a very attractive environment that is safe to fail. So what does that look like? When we have severe flooding events, that whole green space fills with water. Some of those areas are park recreation areas, bicycle paths up and down the city. So instead of the city getting separated by this concrete river, it's separated by this green space, which brings people together rather than separating people. The Indian Bend Wash Greenbelt was the winning prize. I'm trying to figure out what time it is. Okay. The winning prize for our 2019 Resilient Prize because it characterized our 5 characteristics of resilience. And I'm going to take the time since I know we have a little bit of time. Can you see the videos, my video? Probably not. Can you see that video?
No, there's no video playing.
Yeah, I don't see
Okay,
it.
so I'm gonna try to make the video now. I might have to get out of this. See if I can stop that. You guys get to see how well I manage Zoom. The Indian Bend Wash is a magical place.
There's walking trails, biking routes. You can relax, you can take a nap, you can jog, you can do almost anything. The Indian Bend Wash is a solution to a natural problem that we have where cities are moving into their natural environment and there's some sort of conflict. And in this case, runoff from rain, snow melt, or whatever could lead to flooding of streets, flooding of homes. The principle with floods is we try to be fail-safe, that is, no one is injured by them at all. But if you build a cement channel down the middle of your city for almost every day of the year, it's not very pretty and not very useful. The great thing about the solution of the natural green solution of the Indian Bend Wash is that 360 days a year, with the great parks and amenities of the valley.
People come, their children, it's a place where people come to have picnics, to play basketball, to take walks. It's really a place for the community. Oh, and it's a nature.
It's really a nationally recognized example of how what we call green infrastructure can be used to not just replace hardscapes or cement infrastructure, but to do it in a way that most of the year it's something we actually enjoy.
Selecting the Indian Bend Wash was an important decision because it was really about picking an organization or picking an entity or picking an infrastructure that was really impactful. We were inspired by Dr. Roden's 5 characteristics of resilience: aware, integrated, diverse, self-regulating, and adaptive.
I think it meets all the criteria of what people believe or see or want to be part of a space that is welcomes anybody and everybody.
One of the prime examples of adding urban resilience to a region.
This is not an AU effort. This is not a single organization's effort. This is a community effort.
It's really become a diamond for a treasure or a jewel for all of us.
Even though it's a system that has been self-regulating and in existence for many decades, generations of families with this amenity, it's really time to highlight this and highlight the ways that the community can come together for decision making that has a positive impact in so many different ways. Okay, back to my presentation. So I've spent quite a bit of time now in our presentation talking about what community resilience is. And I wanted to share with you a little bit more details on a second framework that helps to drive community resilience, because this is where we start getting into the spatial data piece, which is where we can actually start to make a difference. So as I illustrated, we can, as I mentioned with respect to the current moment, these kinds of shocks and long-term stresses can be social, or in our case right now, very much medical. Of course, there are economic shocks and environmental shocks. And so the starting point for looking at community resilience is to know what are our assets in these areas for a particular community, as well as what are our vulnerabilities, both on the human dimension as well as the physical dimension. And so I mentioned that report that the Piper Trust commissioned to better understand community resilience in Maricopa County. And it's a 30-some page document. And this is an example of how those assets and vulnerabilities were then identified. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'm going to point out a couple of them that are relevant for what we're doing now. First of all, in terms of a social asset, on the human side, there is an incredible nonprofit sector and a very dedicated social sector and a considerable amount of local philanthropy. So there's a lot of people who are willing to work together for the betterment of society, which I think is a really important starting point for us. The other piece that I'm going to be emphasizing is that the number of days greater than 100 degrees Fahrenheit is pretty significant. And this particular year, this particular summer was particularly warm. Those are a couple of things that are going to be relevant as we start looking at the spatial data that help, and the people in the spatial data help change this space of community resilience. So of course the research question, how do we increase human and natural capital to respond to and adapt to social, economic, environmental shocks and long-term stresses? So some of it in terms of our knowledge exchange is about data. So this is a recent data dashboard that we're starting to create. And building again on Dr. Roden's 5 characteristics, this is the knowledge. This is building some self-awareness around summertime heat. So what you're looking at is a single location in the Phoenix area. This is the one in Phoenix, showing average temperature 18 by month. So what you can, of course, with these trend lines is from, and each one of these is, so this is 1900 to 2018, and you can see the average temperature in every single month has increased over time. So we're experiencing hotter and hotter temperatures, not just in our summer months, but also in our winter months. What's particularly is if you actually look at our minimum temperatures rather than just our maximum temperatures, and you can see how that trend line is even deeper. So back in 1900, sometimes the minimum temperatures would get into the into the 70s, and you just don't see that anymore. Now they're in the 80s, and then you can see August and September how much steeper that trend is. So we've pretty significant concern around summer temperatures and really year-round temperatures. So this is, of course, coupled, we call this intersectional effects, coupled with other kinds of things. So for the most part, the residents of Maricopa County have 6% higher utility bills than the average. And when you factor in a shelter in place that we are doing this particular summer, which means that people are relying on the air conditioning in their own homes, which I'm sure many of you have as well, those financial impacts are even greater. Couple that with the fact that on average, families in Maricopa County have $5,000 less annual income than the national average. And of course, high heat has pretty significant health impacts. If people are not hydrating properly or are working in outdoor industries such as landscaping or construction, they're particularly vulnerable. In Phoenix alone, there's 700,000 hospitalizations from heat each year, costing about $5,000 each. So it's a community impact as well as an individual health impact. So I was fortunate to be able to become part of a program called the Utility Assistance Community of Practice. And this builds on that idea that there's a lot of local philanthropy. And what this means is that there a group of about 30-some nonprofits decided that they were going to come together to better understand how we can help with utility assistance. How can we help people better pay for their utility bills and not become vulnerable to this heat exposure? The pieces were just, and I probably should off my PowerPoints here, but we just completed a project with New America that also shows the relationship between utility bill payments and also foreclosures and evictions. And of course, there's a positive correlation between those, that people who struggle with paying their utility bills are much more highly likely to become evicted or have to foreclose on their house because, of course, those economic impacts. That report just came out today, so I'll happily share that with who can share that with others. One of the ways that people pay for utility assistance is a program called LIHEAP out of the federal government. So this is just a copy from their Health and Human Services, the LIHEAP program, which distributes funding to all of the states to support utility assistance. Now with this program, and this is something that is probably relevant in North Carolina as well, is that the formula for distributing these funds is disproportionately advantages cohorts. So in other words, it's utility assistance to help pay for heat during the winter months, as opposed to paying for air conditioning during the summer months. However, if you look at the poverty rate in the United States relative to climate, you can see that our southern communities are the ones who, of course, experience a lot more heat vulnerability or heat exposure, yet they are more likely to be sort of disproportionately poor. This statistic, I think, is particularly alarming. Only 5% of Arizona households that qualify for utility assistance are actually helped. That means that 95% of the community is not helped, and that's a pretty dangerous thing. Okay, the spatial data part. This is my very first slide, why you guys are all here. So let's get into that. Let's start with the big picture of heat resilience. So you saw this framework here of Maricopa County, and this is where people are living. So this is a dot map. Each dot is about 1 point equals about 20 people. So you can kind of see that part of the area has the high density. And you remember I told you this is more population area. So who in this area receives utility assistance? This graphic shows, this map shows where people are receiving utility assistance. 1 point equals 1 case over a 1 year period. So you can see that there are some areas that have less utility assistance. So one of the concerns, one of our partners in this particular case, which was the hunch they had, so back to the hunch lunch, is that you know, what is the demographics of the people who live in that area? So here's a demography comparison. So this is what you're seeing here is the outline of the city of Phoenix. The whole Maricopa County area has multiple municipalities. The city of Phoenix is the largest one, but there's also other cities you've probably heard of like Scottsdale, Mesa, Chandler, Tempe, which is where Arizona State is located. So the piece that you're looking at right now is just the city of Phoenix. And we looked at the comparison between the people in the area that are in that census tract relative to the ones that received utility assistance for that area. And of course, we saw disproportionate drivers. So in the people who received utility assistance, the average household size was larger. In terms of income, the average income was lower. We looked at ethnicity. We actually didn't see a statistically significant difference, but we did see a pretty significant difference between those who are single where the head of household is a single family mom in terms of the percentage. So this was, of course, information that led us to say, well, what's going on with respect to the distribution of utility assistance that the Salvation Army helps to control? So we did a little bit more of a deep dive into their data. So this is January through December 2017. And what this graph shows is that these lower numbers here represent the number of approved cases. So how many received utility assistance? So you can see that 5% appear here pretty quickly that are qualified. So you can see there's an average maybe 40, 20 households receive it. Then you see here, the next bar up is how many were qualified but had to be turned away because of lack of funding. And then this top part was the ones who are not qualified. Well, they made a policy change. This is part of awareness. They made a policy change that said, well, once they get to a certain number of people who call in, let's just turn them away. The impact was pretty severe on the social workers who were having to, on a case-by-case basis, interview all of these people. So that meant that there was a huge amount of stress and fatigue on the social workers at the Salvation Army who were having to turn away 400, 500 people saying, I'm sorry, we don't have utility assistance for you. That's a problem, because what it did was meant if you're first to the post, then you might be considered. But once they go to a different level, then you get turned away. So this really didn't solve the problem. And again, remember, we changed it from solve to respond. This is an example of why that's the case, because it didn't really change the number of individuals who were, it didn't really change the number of individuals who received utility assistance, because you can see that number is still the same. So we started to look at the data in a different way. Right now, if you look over here on this side, the current share of funding is distributed at about 8% every single month. Well, in terms of course, Arizona, in terms of utility assistance, our needs are greatest actually in the September-October timeframe. So if there was a redistribution of the funding that says we're going to take our year-long distribution and put it more during the months in which it's needed, then we can actually serve a greater number of people. Because again, the risks are much lower in the winter months when the temperatures are not so high. Okay, we did this analysis too from a spatial perspective. So one of the requirements for utility assistance recipients is that they actually have to go in person. They might be doing it by Zoom now. I don't actually know that, but they had to go in person to a facility, a Salvation Army facility, to interview to determine whether they were qualified or not. So this is a pretty large geographic area. And what they would do is, I don't actually know how they would assign where individuals would go for interviews, but they would go to a location for an interview. And we looked at this and, well, why is this person all the way here driving all the way down here for their interview when there's other locations that are closer? I don't know about you, but I tend to go to the grocery store that is closest to my house, not one that is all the way across town. So we use this, hocus pocus magic spatial optimization, which if you haven't had the fortune to be in a class to learn about spatial optimization, I'm sure you'll have that opportunity. And it's a great tool, a great resource to say, can we every week on the fly assign the applicants for utility assistance to their nearest interview facility rather than just whatever system they were using before. And of course, that's a very simple process to do. We created the software system for that. And up here, it shows what those changes. And this is assuming that people are driving. So sometimes the time travel is longer if they had to go by bus. But we saved an average of, the average miles before, people had to travel about 7 miles to less than 5. And we looked at overall gasoline savings, as well as the time savings. So a lot of these individuals who are applying for utility assistance, of course, are lower income. They're probably hourly wage. And if they have to take time out of their day to go get a utility assistance interview, that means that that's time that they're not actually in work because they're paid hourly. So making small changes like this in terms of policy can potentially have a significant impact on the individuals. And so this is how data was helping to drive our responses. Okay, I want to go back and look at this again. So again, we see that there's a lot of coverage of utility assistance across Maricopa County, but you can see that there's also gaps. And what you can't see in this graph, but we'll zoom in a little bit, is this area here in a part of the Maricopa County called Mesa. And you can see that when we get to here, you can see there's a lot of the gray underneath, which is the density of the population, but not nearly as much utility assistance recipients. Kind of fading out the green, what we are doing in terms of, again, connecting the dots and exchanging knowledge is actually we obtained also the indoor heat-related deaths from our local county. And so what you can see is there's a pretty high concentration of those indoor heat-related deaths in that area. And so we were trying to understand why there was this big gap in utility assistance that seems to have some kind of correlation with our indoor heat-related deaths. So again, back to this idea of awareness. And it turns out that this part of Mesa, which is the community, has a very, very large number of mobile homes. So what is true that I didn't know is that mobile homes tend to go between the cracks with respect to eligibility for utility assistance. So for a mobile home, these people are owners because they own their mobile home, but they rent the space that they lease, the space that the mobile home sits on. So somehow that combination meant that they were no longer eligible for utility assistance. This also tends to be very low-income housing, people who are vulnerable. And if you've spent any time in a mobile home, they're very susceptible to big changes in temperature. If it gets hot, there's not as much insulation and you can't protect against the heat as much. And so while 4.9% of Maricopa County residents live in mobile homes, which is not a huge percentage, less than 5%, trailer parks are the site of more than 27% of the indoor heat associated deaths. And so you can see that that correlation is pretty alarming and something that we need to pay attention to. Okay, then COVID hit. This is where things really got interesting in terms of what we were going to do, because this was a really example of a community shock. I mean, it has affected everybody, and not just a local one, the way that a hurricane, but a global one. And so the question that we sat down to do is, how are we going to pivot, and how are we going to pivot? What does this mean with respect to our research program? And what we decided in part was that in some ways we shouldn't pivot, in part because it means that, well, what we were doing before didn't matter, which was not the case. But also, if you start to think about what it means to shelter in place, if you're living in a mobile home, as opposed to going to work, which might be air conditioned, that turns into a pretty dangerous proposition. In fact, what we found is that self-isolating from COVID in a mobile home can be incredibly deadly. And this is an article that got published in our local newspaper that drew a lot of attention. So what we've done this summer is to create what we're calling a heat resilience challenge, which was the intent to bring together students from across the university to try to come up with policies and solutions. So, you know, what does trying to make mobile homes a little bit more insulated? How do we improve the efficiency of the air conditioning units on it so that they're not so costly? Can we put a solar panel program in place so that people can draw energy from solar panels? We did this heat resilience challenge this summer, which the intent was to collaborate across, back to Dr. Roden's 5 characteristics of resilience, diversity and collaborate, as well as integrating and finding multiple solutions. Because we know there's not just one solution, but we're hoping to find an integrated set of solutions that can be good for the community as a whole. I want to speak a little bit about what are called dividends. And I think I failed to mention that at the beginning of the presentation, but one of the other things that Dr. Roden talks about significantly because of her, even just the name of her book, which is called dividends. So the Indian Bend Wash Greenbelt, the goal of it is a hydrology system for protecting against flooding. Dividends are felt 360 days a year, which is, it's a park, it's a recreation area, it's nature, it's all these other things. Those are the dividends. So what are the other kinds of dividends in the work that we're doing? And these are right now just a little bit anecdotal. So right here, you're seeing the Mesa Fire Department. The Mesa Fire Department read this article. I don't know how to go back. Oh, I can go back here. Read this article in the Arizona Republic. And they said, wow, that's a pretty significant thing. And so one of the things that they did on their own without prompting us, so it was a case of increasing human capital. They went around to 8,000 individual homes over the summer to check on people's well-being. I think that's a pretty significant response and an anecdotal, a little bit response. So because of the bringing together the data, being able to identify the gap in Mesa where these mobile home parks were, we're able to come back and check, have other people participate and respond to our high heat. I want to give another anecdotal dividend in terms of increasing human capital. Our Hunch Lunch program, we've done this now for 2 years, our Hunch Lunch program. And what was important, so what you may or may not know about social network and social network analysis, which I know a lot of people do social network analysis in geographic programs like that you might be studying or might be in, is that they have a lot of different kinds of ties. So some of them are called loose ties. So it's kind of the one person that you might meet once. So like Ross and John and I, we know each other, but it's not like we go to Christmas at each other's houses. It's loose ties versus these very deep ties that you might have with family in your close inner circle. And so the goal of the Hunch Lunch is to really create a lot of these loose ties. It's like that person from something else, and it really is about who you know. getting jobs, for mobilizing action, these loose ties. You reach out to your network. And the Hunch Lunch is about creating those networks. It's about sharing knowledge. And what we found and what we've heard over the summer is because of the Hunch Lunch efforts, our nonprofit sector was able to mobilize much more quickly to better respond to COVID-19. And they have credited us for creating this Hunch Lunch opportunity because they knew people. They knew somebody who was doing work in food, or they knew somebody who was doing something in homelessness, and they were able to connect with those people. Here's another very specific example of these anecdotal dividends. One of our fellows in the first cohort, so not this year, but the year before, was a gentleman named Nate Smith, who's pictured here, and also with his family. And so he was a fellow for a year in our program. And the work that he does in the Phoenix Rescue Mission is really about food and food security. And one of the things that he did while he was there was he learned about how to expand his network. And what he reported back to us most recently is that because of the work that he did with the knowledge exchange for resilience, is that he was able to mobilize a wider range of supply chain for bringing food into the community to help support people who are suffering from food insecurity because of job loss as a result of COVID-19. So he is a really, really good example about how he goes, I would not have had this network. I would have not had this group of people had I not learned something about that piece of building his network. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that we also, in terms of being adaptive, which was one of the characteristics of resilience, is that we were a little concerned about giving a resilience prize, as we did in 2019 for the Indian Ben Wash, at a time when the community is still really suffering. And so instead, we want to do sort of a recognition of resilience. So as I've mentioned, the nonprofit sector in the community has been incredibly responsive and has been just really mobilized in really, really terrific ways. And we just decided that this year it would be more important for us to recognize how people are contributing to community resilience rather than celebrating it in the same way that we did last year. So instead of doing an individual one, we are doing this recognition of resilience award, in which I now actually have to go review all the nominations, because you can see it was through September 3rd. So I've got now a pile of things that I need to review very soon to identify. We're going to plan on doing a group of them instead of a single one, which I think is appropriate for this particular time. So this is kind of a summary slide. What is it that advances community resilience? What is it that we can do more collaboratively to advance human and social capital, and natural capital? So the first one is identifying vulnerabilities, our assets, and how we currently respond to them. And I've given a couple of examples in terms of how we identified those vulnerabilities and changed our response. The second thing is that we've been able to collect, liberate, analyze, visualize data, a lot of different data sources to better understand these assets. See, we've mobilized a multi-sector network of collaborators, people who are interested in investing their time, even investing their money in terms of making a difference and responding. And then the last one is allocating financial resources for systemic impact and transformation. And I think in this last one, the case of the Mesa Fire Department in terms of how they were able to deploy enough people to go in and check on people's well-being is a really good indication of how our community can respond. Of course, all the work is possible just because of a really great team. 2019, we went to the American Meteorological Society and provided some data, some posters around human heat, and it was a really fun event. It was in the it was down here in the Phoenix area, so it was a great team. And that's my daughter right there, and she was a high school senior and actually had a poster at the American Meteorological Society because, of course, her mom made her volunteer and do some data collection for the project, and she did a great job. I was really happy for that. The team is vast, really, really terrific people, from graduate students, our community collaborators, undergraduates, and just ASU faculty who have been a big part of this. We've also had funding from a lot of different organizations. The Virginia G. Piper Trust has been our primary funding support, but we've also had funding from other organizations, as well as data and collaborations across a whole suite of people. So here's to celebrating resilience, and using sports as a really great analogy for that. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I think given your time, you have about 10 minutes for questions. And I hope that you enjoyed what I had to say. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Libby. Yeah, we have just over 10 minutes. I think folks should just feel free to unmute and ask their questions, or if you prefer, you could put it in the chat and I can read it to Libby, or well, you can read it yourself.
Oh, thanks for the comment on the video. I like the video too.
Oh yeah, if you could put on your video.
Somebody said that. I particularly liked how my eyes went up and then the duck went up. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but that was really funny. I'll have to pick on somebody I know if somebody doesn't ask a question.
We've got one in the chat. Have you been working at all with the Urban Resilience Network between ASU and the New School?
Yes, I do know that program fairly well. So Nancy Grimm, Chuck Redman are some of the people who are on that project. For those of you who don't know, this is a National Science Foundation project on URX that ASU is one of many partners in that space. And I work pretty closely with, so they are working a lot more on the physical systems. We're working more on the social systems. And so we're definitely working collaboratively. And this year we actually have a postdoc who is co-funded between them to try to align the two. Because of course, we're very interested in the impact of heat on the social structures. And they're very much looking at how do we adapt to some of the heat. So that's a great question. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I appreciate that you understood sort of the collaboration between science, sociology, sustainability. I think that's a really great question and a really great observation. The funding challenge right now is actually pretty easy to overcome because the Piper Charitable Trust grant was for $15 million. And so we were able to actually seed a lot of these efforts through that particular grant. Some of our other funding that has come from other sources, including the Nature Conservancy and other pretty well-known organizations, have funded small pieces of the project. So like, for example, the Nature Conservancy was very much interested in trees, a tree program and as an urban cooling effort. And so they were able to fund small pieces of it. And the Nature Conservancy project is actually one that also aligned really well with the URX project in terms of actually creating solutions for urban heat. And so we've been able to get resources for small pieces, but the $15 million grant from the Piper Charitable Trust, really has, provided that overarching support. And we're really working to have this be a long-term, not just a 4 or 5 year grant, which is what it is right now, but something that is actually exists as an institution within ASU. the idea behind this collaboration effort, as well as thinking about community resilience. Community resilience is not an end state. You're not like done. It's something that you have to have that self-regulation. So we're not going to be done with community resilience in 5 years because we don't know what the shocks are going to be that are coming down the way. So thanks, that's a great question.
Libby, I was wondering, have you continued the hunch lunches remotely? And has there been any change, like any new participants or new challenges in that process?
Yeah, so the hunch lunch, the hunch lunch that we had scheduled was like the first week of April, which any of you were getting ready to go to the AAG or anything like that, it was just like gone. So we have reformulated the hunch lunch. So we are doing it virtually. The next one from the one that was canceled, so we're using the same topic. We aim to have 2 per year, one in the fall and one in the spring. So the one last spring was canceled. The one this fall we're going to be doing remotely, but rather than having each one of the participants do these lightning talks live, we already have them pre-recorded. So we do want to have kind of breakout groups. So we're going to have sort of a series of presentations that were pre-recorded, and then aim to create, if done, any of the breakout groups, sort of breakout groups so that people can interact with one another. We think the timing is pretty good because we know a lot of people are becoming a lot more versatile in this environment, getting used to the hand clapping in the chat rooms and being more accustomed to this. So frankly, had we tried to do it last April, I think it would have been a disaster. But I think now we know more about how this online environment works, and it's not going to be the same. We're looking forward to getting back to a hunch lunch. We like bringing together people for food, and that's kind of part of the culture and everything of the hunch lunch as well. But we're hoping to still have that knowledge exchange and connections through a virtual one. So thanks. Oh, thank you, Joshua, for the really good question. So in some ways, it's interesting because we are interacting with our community partners so regularly. So I think we mentioned the hunch lunch, which is the space where we create these looser ties. And then we have these fellows programs where people are working together pretty regularly. They meet once or twice a week and work together. So there isn't quite it isn't quite that same thing of transferring the knowledge and the data to the community, because they're actually part of co-creating it, which I think is a different way of sort of operating in this collaborative way. I mean, the hard part is that it's expensive. This goes back to the question that we already had in terms of funding it, because what we do so that the community partner can be committed to this effort is that we actually buy out a part of their time. So if it's somebody who's working for Valley of the Sun United Way or the City of Phoenix or one of our smaller nonprofits, we actually buy out a part of their time. So they're not volunteering to be part of this program. And so they've been able to come in and be involved. And of course, a lot of our material, like our data and such, are on a data dashboard, so they're automatically accessible. So I think it's going to be a challenge if we can't continue to fund at this same level to sort of continue this, indefinitely.
I think we have time for one more question if there's anyone who wants to ask something.
Well, I'll see if somebody asks a question, but I'm going to kind of speak a little bit more to the students here. And just kind of, as I said, I'm the dean of the graduate college. And what I think is really important is with respect to this talk, I mean, I think that the skills that you're building with respect to data science and spatial data science are just incredibly valuable. These are resources that people want to use all the time. But another part of the skills, of course, are the connections that you have with the people that you're working with. And so really being open to this idea of a knowledge exchange in terms of listening, I think is really important. And then making sure that when you're paying attention to all of these loose ties. As was said in the beginning, one of the other efforts that I have is around advancing women in STEM. And women are actually less likely to invest in the loose ties relative to men. And yet we're showing that the loose ties are actually as valuable as the deep ties. So you might have a really strong relationship with your primary supervisor, but like the colloquium speakers or the speakers like me who come in and meet with you are incredibly valuable in terms of building these long-term networks. So you just don't know who's going to be valuable to you in the future. So as an example, when I was a graduate student, I did my PhD at Penn State more than 2 decades ago. Somebody came into my advisor's office and said, was talking, and I went in and my advisor said, hey, why don't you show him a little bit of your work? And so I just kind of gave a little demo. And this was sort of a loose tie. This was not somebody that I knew at all. And then 2 years later, a job ad at Arizona State for an assistant professor came up, and I wasn't even planning on applying for it because I was like, who wants to live in that hot, dry place? That sounds terrible. So I wasn't even going to apply for the job. But then I got a note from that person who was in the office and said, hey, why don't you make sure you apply for this job? And I'm like, I'll just throw in an application. I mean, I wasn't really even thinking about it. And these loose ties become incredibly valuable for you going forward. So I hope all of you can take sort of the knowledge around, applying it to yourself, applying it to your research, applying it to the work that you're doing, because, those connections, and we're faced with what those look like now. I'm kind of looking around at all these names, hoping that I can somehow capture and remember some of them, because, I would love to be able to say hello and get to know you better. So thanks a lot.
Well, that's a wonderful offer. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Libby. I know the students appreciate it, as well as everyone in the center. So thank you for your time. It was a wonderful talk.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed being part of this today. So thank you for inviting me, and I do hope that we have a chance to meet in person. If any of you do happen to run into me at something, please say hello to me. Tell me that you saw this talk, because I won't remember everybody's name, but I do hope we connect sometime in the future. So thank you for the invitation and for being here today. It was great attendance.
And Libby, thank you very much. This is John. I just want to let you know you're invited to the Geospatial social directly following this forum. And I put the Zoom link in the chat window.
Well, I wish I could. I have to get to, we've got a job candidate in, and with this director job that I have now, I have to jump into a job talk. Not my job, but somebody else's job talk. So.
Sure.
It's not quite social time in Arizona.
It's not. It's still very much work time.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.